Before we begin our journey into the shadowy life of one of America's most powerful crime lords, I must pause to tell you this. The story you are about to hear is not a work of fiction. It is a tapestry woven from decades of FBI files, congressional testimony, court documents, and the accounts of those who lived in his world. It is presented to you with the sole purpose of delivering a comprehensive and accurate historical account, pieced together from various sources for your understanding. The path we walk is dark, filled with crime, corruption, and violence, but it is a real part of our history. If you are ready to delve into the true story of the man who may have held a grudge against a president, then settle in, relax, and let the story unfold. And if you find these forgotten chapters of history fascinating, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the lives of those who operated from the shadows. Your support helps bring these complex stories to light. The story of Carlos Marcello begins not in the bustling streets of New Orleans, but across the ocean in the sun-baked land of Tunisia, where he was born Calogero Minacor in 1910 to Sicilian parents, a detail that would forever anchor his identity and his code of conduct in the old-world traditions of silence and omerta. His family, like countless others seeking a sliver of the American dream, embarked on the arduous journey to the United States. But their arrival was not through the hallowed gates of Ellis Island that welcomed so many millions. Instead, they entered through the port of New Orleans, a city that itself was a vibrant, chaotic, and deeply corrupt melting pot. A place where the lines between the legal and the illicit were not so much blurred as they were intentionally erased for the right price. The Minacor family, including the young boy who would soon be known as Carlos, was classified as illegal aliens from the very start, a technicality that would haunt him for decades and shape his profound distrust of the federal government. It was in the sweltering, mosquito-ridden hinterlands of Jefferson Parish, just outside the New Orleans city limits, that Carlos grew up, in an area known as the Irish Channel, though it was a haven for Sicilian immigrants. The environment was tough, unforgiving, and taught its lessons with fists and knives. Young Carlos did not take to formal education. The streets were his university, and the curriculum was survival. He learned to read men, not books, to understand the flow of money, not of rivers, and to value power above all else. His first forays into the world of crime were small, almost insignificant, running errands for local gamblers, acting as a lookout for bootleggers during the twilight years of Prohibition, and learning the intricate geography of the city's vice districts. He was a quick study, possessing a quiet, observant nature that masked a ferocious ambition. He was not a brawler, he was a thinker. He understood that real power was not taken in a street fight, but was acquired through leverage, patience, and the careful cultivation of fear and respect. He quickly graduated from petty crimes to running his own small-time rackets, specializing in slot machines and numbers games. But his big break, the moment that catapulted him from a mere hoodlum to a figure of note in the New Orleans underworld, came with his association with the notorious Vito Vic Mangono, a lieutenant of the New Orleans crime family then led by Sam Silverdollar Sam Carolla. Marcello proved his worth not with muscle, but with his brilliant, organized mind for business. He demonstrated an unparalleled genius for the mechanics of illegal gambling, setting up a network that was efficient, expansive, and incredibly profitable. He saw the potential in the vast, labyrinthine bayous that surrounded the city, using the isolated waterways and fishing camps as perfect locations for his high-stakes casinos and floating craps games, places where judges, politicians, and police captains could gamble away their salaries and their integrity far from prying eyes. It was this ability to cater to the vices of the powerful that became the cornerstone of his empire. He made himself indispensable to the Carolla regime by being the man who could get things done, who could guarantee a steady stream of cash, and who knew how to keep his mouth shut. His rise was steady, methodical, and largely bloodless compared to the violent power struggles that characterized other crime families in cities like New York or Chicago. When Sam Carolla was finally deported back to Sicily in 1947, the mantle of leadership did not fall to the most violent enforcer, but to the most capable businessman, Carlos Marcello. He was 37 years old, and now he was the boss. His first order of business was to solidify his control and present a new, more respectable public face. He moved his base of operations from the traditional Italian neighborhoods of the French Quarter to a seemingly innocuous building on the outskirts of the city that housed the Brownell and Field towboat service and the offices of the Pelican Tomato Company. It was from this bland, unassuming headquarters, smelling of ripe fruit and river water, that Marcello would command an empire that stretched across multiple states. The Tomato Company was a perfect front, It provided a legitimate seeming reason for a constant flow of trucks and boats. It generated clean cash to commingle with the dirty millions from his rackets, and it became a symbolic throne room. Here, in a small, cluttered office, local sheriffs, state legislators, and even congressmen would come to pay their respects, to seek favors, or to receive their orders. Marcello ruled not with shouts, but with whispers, not with threats, but with unspoken understandings. He cultivated politicians with the same care a gardener tends his plants, understanding that political protection was the most valuable currency of all. He had a simple, brutal philosophy: every man has a price, and if you couldn't find it, you weren't looking hard enough. He built a web of corruption so deep and so vast that it became the true government of Louisiana, an invisible state operating in perfect synchrony with the visible one. And at the center of this web sat Carlos Marcello, the quiet, unassuming, with his power base firmly established and the political machinery of Louisiana effectively greased to run in his favor. Carlos Marcello's empire began to expand in ways that were both audacious and meticulously calculated, reaching far beyond the bayous and into the very heart of American power. The foundation of his vast wealth remained illegal gambling, a sprawling, sophisticated operation that was less a series of backroom games and more a corporate enterprise. He controlled a network of thousands of slot machines, pinball machines that paid off in cash, and illegal bookmaking operations that handled bets on everything from horse races to political elections, each one a tiny tributary feeding into a mighty river of untaxed, illicit cash. But his true genius lay in the Black Pot, a legendary, secretive, and immensely profitable high-stakes gambling operation that moved like a ghost between plush, hidden rooms in New Orleans and secure, remote locations deep within the Louisiana swamps, accessible only by boat and known only to a trusted few. Here, in these smoke-filled sanctums, the wealthy elite of the South, business tycoons, oil barons, and respected pillars of the community, would risk fortunes on the turn of a card or the roll of dice, all under the protective, invisible umbrella of Marcello's organization. This operation was a masterclass in logistics and security, with lookouts posted for miles, and a communication system that could rival a military operation, ensuring that the games were never raided, the clients never embarrassed, and the profits never interrupted. The cash generated was staggering, but it presented its own problem: how to launder millions in dirty money and integrate it into the legitimate economy. This is where Marcello's business acumen truly shone. He began investing heavily in legitimate businesses, not just as a front, but as real, profit-generating ventures. He acquired holdings in laundromats, jukebox distributorships, bars, restaurants, and most notably, real estate. He bought vast tracts of land, office buildings, and hotels, creating a complex web of holding companies and intermediaries that made tracing the ultimate ownership nearly impossible for authorities. He understood the power of the labor union and formed a symbiotic, a notoriously dangerous, alliance with the Teamsters union and its fearsome leader, Jimmy Hoffa. Through his control over the New Orleans waterfront and his influence with local unions, Marcello could guarantee labor peace for a price, or conversely, he could paralyze a business with a strategically called strike. The Teamsters' massive, centrally controlled pension fund, a multi-million-dollar cash reservoir, became a personal bank for Marcello's ambitions. With a phone call to Hoffa, he could secure multi-million-dollar loans for his casino projects in Las Vegas or his real estate developments, further entwining his criminal empire with the fabric of legitimate American finance. This expansion was not confined to the South. His reach extended along the entire Gulf Coast, into Texas, Arkansas, and Florida, where he had formal sit-downs with other crime bosses like Santo Trafficante Jr. of Tampa, dividing territories and coordinating national criminal strategy. He became a respected, almost revered figure on the National Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia, not because of his violent exploits, but because of his phenomenal earning power and his impeccable judgment. He was the quiet banker, the strategic thinker, the man who could make problems disappear without a single shot being fired. His influence even stretched into the bizarre and shadowy world of intelligence, when, in a twisted plot that seemed ripped from a pulp novel, the CIA allegedly approached him through intermediaries to solicit his help in assassinating Cuban leader Fidel Castro. The irony was thick and dark. The United States government, in its desperation to eliminate a foreign dictator, was seeking an alliance with a domestic crime lord who operated with near-total impunity. This period, the 1950s, was the golden age of Marcello's reign, a time when he was untouchable, a phantom king whose name was whispered in the halls of power but rarely appeared in the newspapers, a man who had perfected the art of wielding immense power while remaining, to the general public, utterly invisible. All The golden, untouchable era of Carlos Marcello's reign, however, could not last forever, and the first major crack in his formidable empire appeared not from a local rival or a state investigator, but from the relentless, idealistic ambition of a young politician on the national stage, Robert F. Kennedy. As chief counsel for the Senate Rackets Committee in the late 1950s, Kennedy developed a singular obsession with dismantling organized crime, and he saw the quiet, powerful boss from New Orleans as a prime symbol of the corruption he sought to eradicate. The confrontations between the two in the hearing room were legendary, a clash of two utterly different worlds. Kennedy, sharp, aggressive, and morally righteous, fired question after question, trying to pierce Marcello's calm, impenetrable exterior. Marcello, in turn, was a master of evasion, repeatedly invoking the Fifth Amendment in a soft, almost inaudible mumble, his demeanor a mixture of bored indifference and quiet contempt. He refused to be baited, refused to be intimidated, and in doing so, he infuriated Kennedy more than any loudmouthed, defiant gangster ever could. This personal vendetta would escalate to devastating proportions when Robert Kennedy became Attorney General of the United States in 1961, under the administration of his brother, President John F. Kennedy. With the full power of the federal government now at his disposal, Bobby Kennedy declared a war on crime, and he made Carlos Marcello his public enemy number one. The weapon he chose was not murder or conspiracy charges, which were nearly impossible to prove against a man as insulated as Marcello, but a more fundamental, personal one, Marcello's questionable citizenship status. In a stunning and controversial move, federal agents apprehended Marcello without a warrant and forcibly expelled him from the United States, flying him to Guatemala and essentially dumping him in the Central American jungle with no money or papers. This act, which Marcello would later refer to as being kidnapped by his own government, was more than a legal maneuver. It was a profound personal humiliation and a declaration of total war. For a man who had built an empire on respect and control, to be treated like a stray animal was an unforgivable insult. The deep, simmering resentment Marcello felt toward the Kennedys transformed into a white-hot, all-consuming hatred. He managed, through a combination of bribes, forged documents, and sheer force of will, to make his way back to the United States, fighting his deportation through the courts and eventually returning to New Orleans to a hero's welcome from his underworld associates. But he was a changed man. The experience had stripped away his sense of invincibility and replaced it with a cold, focused rage. He was heard on FBI wiretaps making vague, ominous threats, speaking of the need to get rid of the dog by hitting it not on the tail, but on the head. While he never explicitly ordered the assassination of the president on any recorded tape, the intent and the motive were chillingly clear to the agents who listened. The Kennedy administration's relentless pressure continued, with the IRS auditing his every financial move and FBI surveillance becoming a constant, oppressive presence. His empire was under siege as never before, and the pressure was immense and unyielding. Then, on a sunny day in November 1963, the world stopped. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Within hours, the FBI's attention turned to the men who had been publicly targeted by the administration, and Carlos Marcello's name was at the top of the list. He had the motive, the means, and the connections. He was a man who had been personally and professionally destroyed by the Kennedy brothers, a man who operated in a world where murder was a business solution, and a man who had the network to make a problem of any magnitude disappear. The official investigations, from the Warren Commission to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, would later conclude that while individuals like Lee Harvey Oswald were responsible, the plotting of organized crime figures could not be definitively ruled out. The House Committee even stated that Marcello had both the motive and the opportunity, and that he was a prime suspect. For the rest of his life, Marcello would vehemently and repeatedly deny any involvement, but the shadow of Dallas would forever be cast over his legacy, transforming him from a powerful crime boss into a central, sinister figure in one of the most enduring and tragic mysteries in American history, a permanent, dark stain on his story that would outlive all his other criminal accomplishments and ensure that his name would... The cataclysmic event in Dallas cast a long, inescapable shadow over Carlos Marcello's world, ushering in an era defined not by expansion and quiet power, but by relentless legal siege and the gradual, inexorable erosion of his formidable empire. The death of President Kennedy did not, as Marcello might have hoped, end the scrutiny. Instead, it intensified it 1,000-fold. transforming the FBI's organized crime division from a persistent nuisance into a vengeful, single-minded force dedicated to proving his involvement and dismantling his organization piece by piece. Under the directive of J. Edgar Hoover, who had been stung by criticism of the Bureau's pre-assassination inaction, every resource was turned towards the New Orleans boss. His life was no longer his own. His telephones were wiretapped, his offices bugged, his cars tailed by a rotating shift of federal agents who made no attempt to conceal their presence. The intention was psychological warfare, to make him feel the constant, choking pressure of the state, to remind him that he was a hunted man. This oppressive surveillance, while failing to yield a direct confession to the assassination, provided a treasure trove of evidence on his daily criminal operations, coded discussions about skimmed casino profits, conversations about union payoffs, and the intricate details of his vast political corruption network. This evidence became the foundation for a series of federal prosecutions that would dog him for the next 2 decades. He was tried and acquitted in several cases, a testament to his ability to intimidate witnesses and the deep-seated fear he instilled in potential jurors. But the legal battles were a constant drain on his resources and energy. The old ways of doing business, the quiet meetings at the Pelican Tomato Company, the subtle exchanges with judges and politicians, became fraught with peril. Every handshake, every whispered conversation, was potentially being recorded by a hidden microphone, transforming his once secure headquarters into a goldfish bowl. The world around him was also changing. The Mafia's golden age was ending, supplanted by new, more chaotic criminal enterprises like drug cartels that did not play by the old rules of omerta and respect. The federal government, armed with new laws like the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, RICO Act, finally had the legal tool it needed to attack the entire structure of his crime family, rather than just its individual members. The RICO statute allowed prosecutors to connect the dots between seemingly disparate crimes, gambling, extortion, murder, conspiracy, and present them as a single, ongoing criminal enterprise, a perfect blueprint of Marcello's entire operation. The final, decisive blow came in 1981, when he was indicted in a massive RICO case that alleged he was the mastermind behind a sprawling plot to bribe a state judge for favorable rulings. The trial was the culmination of a lifetime of work by federal investigators. The prosecution's star witness was not a rival gangster, but a former Louisiana state senator who wore a wire for the FBI, capturing hours of incriminating conversations. It was a modern takedown, using technology and federal law to achieve what street violence and local corruption never could. In 1981, at the age of 71, Carlos Marcello was convicted and sentenced to an effective life sentence in prison. The man who had ruled an invisible kingdom from a tomato-scented office was now just another number in the federal penitentiary system. His appeals dragged on for years, but the walls had finally closed in. The empire he had built so carefully over 5 decades began to crumble almost immediately in his absence. Without his strategic mind and authoritative presence, factions within his organization began to war with each other, and new, hungrier criminals moved in to claim his territories. The political protection that had once been so absolute evaporated, as new generations of politicians had no loyalty to the old, imprisoned king. In 1989, after years of legal battles, his lawyers managed to secure his release, arguing that his advanced age and deteriorating health, including the onset of dementia, made him no longer a threat. He returned to New Orleans, an old, broken man, a ghost haunting the city he once owned. The city itself had moved on. The world of backroom deals and bayou casinos was giving way to a new era of legalized gambling and corporate tourism. Carlos Marcello died in 1993, not in a hail of gunfire as so many of his contemporaries had, but from natural causes, a quiet, almost mundane end for a figure of such immense and dark legend. His legacy is a complex and troubling one. He was a brutal crime lord who built an empire on fear and corruption, a prime suspect in the nation's most dramatic murder, and yet also a paradox. A man who valued family, avoided unnecessary violence, and operated for decades as a shadow governor. A stark reminder of how deeply the roots of organized crime can penetrate the foundations of American society when ambition, opportunity, and systemic corruption converge. The enduring legacy of Carlos Marcello extends far beyond the grave, a spectral presence that continues to inform our understanding of power, corruption, and the elusive nature of justice in modern America. His life story serves as a dark blueprint, a case study in how a criminal enterprise can become so deeply enmeshed with the legitimate structures of society that the two become almost indistinguishable, operating in a sinister symbiosis that corrupts from within. The political machine he so expertly manipulated in Louisiana did not die with him. It merely evolved, adapting to new eras and new players. But the fundamental lesson he embodied, that influence can be purchased and power can be wielded from the shadows, remains a permanent, cautionary tale. His name is rarely invoked in the vibrant, tourist-filled streets of modern New Orleans, a city that has largely chosen to sanitize its history, preferring the romantic tales of jazz and voodoo to the grim realities of its underworld past. Yet, for historians and criminologists, Marcello represents a pivotal figure, a bridge between the old-world Sicilian Mafia and the new-world American syndicate. A man who proved that immense wealth and influence could be accumulated not through loud, theatrical violence, but through quiet, relentless pressure on the levers of economic and political power. The methods he perfected, from the sophisticated money laundering through legitimate businesses to the strategic alliance with national labor unions, became the textbook for generations of organized crime figures who followed, though few ever achieved his level of seamless integration. The unanswered questions surrounding his potential role in the Kennedy assassination have ensured his place in the pantheon of American conspiracy theories, a subject of endless debate and speculation that has spawned countless books, documentaries, and fevered online discussions. This unresolved mystery acts as a kind of historical black hole, forever pulling his other, more concrete criminal achievements into its gravitational field, ensuring that his story is never fully told without that final, dark asterisk. The federal government's ultimate victory in using the RICO statute to imprison him marked a turning point in the war on organized crime, proving that even the most insulated and powerful crime lords were vulnerable to a sustained, technologically advanced legal assault. Yet, in a bitter irony, the void left by the dismantling of his highly structured, territorial organization was not filled by law and order, but by a new, more volatile, and far less predictable wave of criminality centered on the international drug trade, suggesting that the defeat of one kingpin often simply clears the stage for a new, and sometimes worse, form of chaos. The final years of his life, spent in the fog of dementia, stand in stark, tragic contrast to the sharp, calculating mind that once commanded an empire, a poignant reminder of the ultimate frailty of all human power. Today, the physical landmarks of his reign have largely vanished. The Pelican tomato company is gone, replaced by anonymous modern developments, and the hidden bayou casinos have been reclaimed by the swamp, their secrets swallowed by the murky waters. Carlos Marcello exists now as an idea more than a man, a symbol of a bygone era of crime, a permanent suspect in a national nightmare, and a complex archetype of the American dream twisted into its most sinister and successful form. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the permeability of our institutions and the enduring allure of illicit power, leaving behind a legacy not of honor or respect, but of a chilling, masterful, and profoundly impactful corruption that, like a ghost in the machine, continues to whisper from the pages of history, challenging us to remember that the greatest threats to a society are not always the ones that announce themselves with a bang, but often those that advance with a. To truly grasp the monolithic nature of Carlos Marcello's power, one must look beyond the simplistic labels of mob boss and understand the intricate, day-to-day machinery of his rule, a system of control so comprehensive it functioned as a parallel government, collecting its own taxes and enforcing its own laws with an efficiency that often put the official state apparatus to shame. His was not a reign of random terror, but a calculated, corporate-like structure where violence was not the first tool, but the final, decisive one, reserved for those who breached contracts, cooperated with authorities, or threatened the delicate ecosystem of his empire. The lifeblood of this empire was, without question, the street tax, a ubiquitous and inescapable levy imposed on every single criminal enterprise operating within his vast territory, from the smallest back-alley dice game to the most sophisticated interstate narcotics operation. No one could so much as run a brothel, a bookmaking ring, or an unlicensed bar without kicking a significant percentage of their profits up the chain, through a series of intermediaries, until it landed in Marcello's coffers. This was not mere extortion, it was a franchising system. In return for this tax, operators received the Marcello family's protection, a guarantee that they would not be harassed by rival gangs and, most crucially, a form of immunity from local law enforcement. This is where the true genius of his operation lay, his deep and corrupting influence over the police, sheriff's departments, and judicial system in Louisiana and beyond. He did not just bribe individual officers, he systematically compromised the entire structure. Police captains on his payroll would tip his organization off about upcoming raids, ensuring his own operations were never touched while simultaneously targeting his competitors. Judges were indebted to him for campaign contributions or were compromised by vices indulged in his hidden casinos, leading to favorable rulings, dismissed charges for his associates, and warrants that mysteriously never materialized. This control over the justice system created a climate of absolute impunity for his own men and utter helplessness for his enemies. His political influence operated on a similar, though more sophisticated, tier. At the lowest level, he controlled ward heelers and precinct captains who could deliver blocks of votes with machine-like precision, ensuring that local elections went his way. On a state level, he cultivated long-term relationships with governors, attorneys general, and powerful state senators, relationships built not on one-off bribes but on a continuous exchange of favors. Massive campaign donations delivered in cash-filled briefcases in exchange for lucrative state contracts, favorable zoning laws for his real estate developments, or the sudden withdrawal of a pesky investigator from a sensitive case. His reach even extended to the halls of the U.S. Congress, where he maintained alliances with powerful Southern senators who could, on his behalf, make a discreet phone call to the Justice Department to inquire about the overly enthusiastic work of a particular U.S. attorney. This multi-layered shield of political and legal protection was his greatest asset, allowing his business to flourish for decades. Within his own organization, he ruled with a patriarchal, yet firm, hand. He demanded absolute loyalty, but in return, he provided for his soldiers and their families in a way that the government never could. If a man was arrested, Marcello's network of corrupt lawyers would provide the best defense. If a man was sent to prison, his family would receive a regular stipend to live on. If a man was killed in the line of duty, his widow and children would be cared for. This created a powerful bond of fealty that went beyond fear. It was a twisted form of corporate loyalty. His own personal life was curiously modest, especially when compared to the flamboyant lifestyles of crime bosses in other cities. He lived not in a sprawling mansion, but in a comfortable, well-appointed home in a quiet suburb, preferring to invest his millions back into his expanding web of legitimate and illegitimate businesses. He was a family man, devoted to his wife and children, and he actively encouraged his associates to present a similar image of respectable stability to the outside world. This duality was key to his longevity. He was not a flashy target. He was, to all outward appearances, a successful, if slightly mysterious, businessman. This carefully constructed facade of normalcy, combined with the near-total immunity granted by his corrupted institutions, allowed Carlos Marcello to operate on a scale that is almost difficult to comprehend, building a criminal corporation that was at once utterly ruthless and brilliantly managed, a dark mirror of the American capitalist dream, proving that the most powerful empire is not the one that conquers through force alone, but the one that becomes so deeply and inextricably woven into the fabric of society. The labyrinthine network of Carlos Marcello's influence, however, was not confined to the gritty streets of New Orleans or the corrupt backrooms of Baton Rouge. It extended its tendrils across the nation, forging alliances that turned his regional power into a force of national significance, a development that would ultimately draw the devastating attention of Washington D.C. His most formidable and fateful partnership was with Jimmy Hoffa, the fiery president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, a union that controlled the flow of nearly every truck and the muscle of every driver in America. This was a symbiotic relationship forged in mutual need and immense profit. Marcello, through his control of the New Orleans waterfront and the trucking routes throughout the Gulf South, could guarantee labor peace for the Teamsters, ensuring shipments moved without interference from strikes or sabotage. In return, Hoffa provided access to the Teamsters' massive Central States Pension Fund, a multi-billion-dollar reservoir of cash that was, in effect, the organized crime's personal bank. With a simple nod from Hoffa, Marcello could secure multi-million-dollar loans for his expanding ventures, most notably for the development of casinos in the burgeoning desert oasis of Las Vegas. This influx of capital from the Teamsters Fund allowed Marcello and his associates, including figures like Meyer Lansky and Santo Trafficante Jr., to gain a hidden but substantial financial interest in several key Las Vegas properties, effectively allowing them to skim millions of dollars from the counting rooms before the money was ever officially recorded. A clandestine operation that funneled a river of untaxed cash back to the crime families across the United States. This national web of finance and influence inevitably brought him into the crosshairs of the Kennedy administration, first through Robert Kennedy's relentless pursuit of Hoffa on the Senate Rackets Committee, and then, catastrophically, through the full force of the Justice Department. The relationship with Hoffa was more than business. It was a bond between two powerful, stubborn men who shared a deep and personal hatred for the Kennedys, a hatred that festered in private conversations and wiretapped calls. This national footprint also drew Marcello into one of the most bizarre chapters of the Cold War, the CIA's plots to assassinate Cuban leader Fidel Castro. Through his pre-revolutionary casino interests in Havana and his ongoing narcotics and smuggling routes through the Caribbean, Marcello had maintained close ties with the Cuban exile community and with his counterpart in Florida, Santo Traficante Jr., who had also been pushed out of his lucrative Havana holdings by Castro. The CIA, desperate and operating in a moral gray zone, saw these mobsters as perfect instruments. They had the motive, the means, and the deniability to carry out a politically sensitive assassination. While the full extent of Marcello's direct involvement remains shrouded in classified files and contradictory testimony, the mere fact that such a partnership was contemplated highlights the staggering level of power and reach he had attained. The United States government was now seeking a pact with the devil it was simultaneously trying to destroy. This intersection with the CIA, the Teamsters, and the Kennedy administration placed Marcello at the very epicenter of a perfect storm of conspiracy, vengeance, and power politics. The forced deportation, the kidnapping as he called it, was the spark, but this national network of alliances and enemies provided the fuel for an inferno of speculation that would forever link his name to the tragedy in Dallas. He was no longer just a regional crime boss. He was a national player whose actions and associations had consequences that reverberated at the highest levels of American power, a testament to a criminal empire that had grown so vast and so interconnected that its tendrils had, in their own dark way, become part of the nervous system of the nation itself. A shadow network operating just beneath the surface of post-war American prosperity, until the immense pressure exerted by the Kennedy administration, culminating in the deeply personal humiliation of his deportation, created a perilous new reality for Carlos Marcello, forcing him to operate from a defensive posture for the first time in his long career and setting the stage for the most controversial and darkly speculative chapter of his life. The once impenetrable shield of political protection he enjoyed in Louisiana proved useless against the focused might of the federal government, led by an attorney general who viewed him not just as a criminal, but as a personal nemesis. This shift from being the hunter to the hunted fundamentally altered Marcello's calculus. The quiet, corporate-like management of his empire was no longer sufficient to counter an enemy who wielded the full legal and investigative power of the United States. It was in this cauldron of intense pressure and seething resentment that the events leading to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy unfolded, events that would forever bind Marcello's name to one of history's greatest mysteries. While no court of law ever convicted him of involvement, the circumstantial case built by years of federal investigations paints a compelling and troubling picture of motive, opportunity, and means. The motive was undeniable and powerfully personal. Robert Kennedy's war against him had escalated beyond business into a vendetta that struck at Marcello's very identity and freedom. In the eyes of the underworld, removing the president was not an act of political ideology, but a brutal, pragmatic solution to a crippling business problem. With JFK out of office, the aggressively anti-crime attorney general would inevitably be removed, and the relentless federal pressure would cease. This cold-blooded logic is at the heart of the case against him. The opportunity was equally plausible. Marcello's network was national and international. He had associates and operatives throughout the country, particularly in the Gulf South and in Texas, where the assassination occurred. The city of Dallas was a known hub for his criminal activities, including gun running and narcotics, and his organization had the logistical capability to move people, money, and weapons with quiet efficiency. The means were his stock in trade. He commanded an organization that specialized in violence and, crucially, in silence. The use of a patsy, a fall guy who could be manipulated and then silenced, was a classic Mafia tactic, one that Marcello would have been intimately familiar with. The official conclusion of the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 1970s explicitly stated that Marcello, along with Santo Traficante Jr., had the motive, means, and opportunity to assassinate the president and that they were likely involved in a conspiracy. This finding was based on extensive testimony, including that of Marcello's own brother, Joseph, who reportedly told an FBI informant that Carlos was so enraged by his deportation that he began plotting the president's death. Furthermore, the committee found the testimony of several witnesses credible, who claimed that Marcello had made threats against the president's life, using his characteristic coded language, saying that he was going to use a nut to do the job, a chilling reference to using an unstable individual as a pawn. The most damning circumstantial evidence lies in the aftermath. Following the assassination, the intense federal scrutiny on Marcello's empire mysteriously and abruptly eased for a period, as if the primary driving force behind it had been removed. For the rest of his life, Marcello consistently and vehemently denied any role, often while invoking the Fifth Amendment, but the shadow of doubt was permanently cast. His later convictions on racketeering charges, while related to other crimes, served to publicly cement his image as a man capable of the highest levels of criminal conspiracy. The assassination of John F. Kennedy represents the absolute zenith of Marcello's power in the darkest sense. It was the moment his criminal influence arguably reached its furthest point, touching the very apex of American political life, and simultaneously, it was the beginning of his ultimate downfall, as the event created a legend around him that was too large and too dark for any criminal, no matter how powerful or insulated, to ever truly escape, ensuring that his legacy would forever be debated not just in courtrooms, but in the seismic shockwaves emanating from Dallas on November 22, 1963, irrevocably altered the trajectory of Carlos Marcello's life and empire, plunging him into a relentless, decades-long storm of legal persecution and public infamy from which he would never truly escape. While he may have momentarily believed that the removal of his primary antagonist, President Kennedy, would herald a return to the untouchable status quo of his golden years, the opposite occurred. The assassination made him a permanent fixture on the federal government's most wanted list, not for a specific crime, but for the ultimate crime. The FBI's focus, once divided among many organized crime figures, now had a singular, obsessive target, proving Marcello's involvement in the murder of a president. This was no longer about racketeering or illegal gambling. It was a national crusade for justice, and he was its prime suspect. The once tolerable surveillance transformed into an oppressive, inescapable presence. His office at the Pelican Tomato Company, once a sanctuary of power, was now riddled with hidden microphones. His home was watched, his cars were followed in blatant convoys, and his every financial transaction was dissected by a small army of IRS agents. This constant, glaring scrutiny made the discreet operation of his vast criminal network nearly impossible. The corrupt politicians and law enforcement officials who had once taken his money with a wink and a nod now found the association too toxic, too dangerous. The shadow of the presidency was too long, and the heat was too intense. One by one, the pillars of his political protection began to crumble under the weight of federal pressure, leaving his empire exposed and vulnerable. The old methods of witness intimidation became riskier, as any sudden disappearance or suspicious death of a potential informant would immediately be linked back to the Kennedy case, bringing down an even greater avalanche of scrutiny. This forced him into a defensive, reactive posture for the remainder of his career, constantly fighting legal battles on multiple fronts. He was tried and acquitted in several cases throughout the 1960s and 70s, a testament to his enduring ability to manipulate the local legal system and instill fear in juries. But each victory was Pyrrhic, draining his financial resources and the morale of his organization. The world was changing, and the code of omerta that had protected him for so long was beginning to fracture. The younger generation of mobsters was less disciplined, more prone to the lucrative temptations of the drug trade, and more willing to break the sacred vow of silence to save their own skins. The federal government, armed with new weapons like the Witness Protection Program and the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, RICO Act, finally had the tools to dismantle entire criminal enterprises. The RICO statute, in particular, was a masterpiece of legal engineering designed for men like Marcello. It allowed prosecutors to connect the dots between the boss and the foot soldiers, between the murder committed in 1950 and the gambling operation in 1970, painting a panoramic picture of a continuing criminal enterprise. The final, decisive legal assault began in earnest in the late 1970s, culminating in the famous Brillab investigation, an FBI sting operation that captured Marcello on tape discussing the bribery of a state judge. It was this case, built on the foundation of thousands of hours of wiretaps and the testimony of a wired informant, that finally succeeded where all others had failed. In 1981, at the age of 71, Carlos Marcello was convicted under the RICO statute and sentenced to an effective life sentence in federal prison. The conviction was not for the assassination, but for the very racketeering that had built his empire. It was a symbolic end, proving that while the crown of a conspiracy to kill a president may have forever eluded prosecutors, the throne from which he ruled, the systematic corruption, the extortion, the illegal gambling, could be, and was, utterly destroyed. His imprisonment marked the definitive end of his reign, and without his strategic mind at the helm, his once formidable crime family quickly fractured into warring factions and was eventually supplanted by new, more decentralized. The final decade of Carlos Marcello's life was a stark and protracted epilogue, a slow-motion unraveling that stood in grim contrast to the meteoric rise and formidable reign that had defined his earlier years. His 1981 RICO conviction was not merely a legal setback. It was the definitive severing of the intricate, invisible threads that connected him to his power, leaving him a king in exile within his own country's prison system. The federal penitentiary became his new, shrunken kingdom, a world of concrete and steel where his reputation meant little and the authority he had so meticulously cultivated over 5 decades evaporated into the sterile, controlled prison air. The appeals process, which dragged on for years, became a draining, hopeless battle against a federal machine that had finally perfected its methods for dismantling men like him. His once razor-sharp mind, which had navigated the complex currents of political corruption and underworld alliances with such masterful precision, began to falter under the weight of age, incarceration, and the onset of dementia. This cognitive decline added a layer of tragic pathos to his final years. The strategic genius who had outmaneuvered senators and prosecutors could now barely recall the details of the empire he had built. Meanwhile, the world he had left behind was transforming at a dizzying pace. The city of New Orleans, which had once operated on the fuel of his hidden economy, was moving on. The old political machines were dying, replaced by a new breed of politician less susceptible to the old-fashioned charms of cash-filled envelopes. The criminal landscape, too, was evolving. The structured, almost corporate hierarchy of the Mafia was being displaced by more volatile, less predictable street gangs and international drug cartels that recognized no traditional territories or codes of conduct. The Pelican Tomato Company, his symbolic throne room, was gone, a physical metaphor for the complete disintegration of his power base. In 1989, his legal team, arguing his advanced age and deteriorating mental state, managed to secure his release from prison. He returned to his home in Metairie, Louisiana, an old, frail, and confused man, a ghost haunting the periphery of the city he had once owned. There was no triumphant return, no respectful visits from the powerful figures who now controlled the city's underworld. He was a relic, a forgotten artifact from a bygone era. His days were no longer filled with strategic meetings and coded phone calls, but with the quiet, mundane routines of an elderly invalid, a far cry from the individual who had commanded a network of thousands and whose name had once struck fear into the hearts of millionaires and government officials alike. He lived out these final years in this state of obscurity and mental fog, a profound and ironic punishment for a man whose greatest weapon had always been his intellect. Carlos Marcello died on March 2, 1993, from a heart attack, a quiet, natural end that seemed almost disappointingly mundane for a figure shrouded in so much violence and legend. There was no massive underworld funeral, no dramatic eulogies from powerful associates. His passing was noted by the press, but it was largely treated as the closing of a historical chapter, the final footnote on a life that had already receded into the annals of infamy. His legacy, therefore, is a deeply fractured and contradictory one. He is remembered as a prime suspect in the century's most traumatic crime, a label that has forever tainted his story with the darkest possible brush. Yet, he is also studied as a criminal innovator, a master of political corruption who demonstrated the vulnerabilities in the American system and who built an empire not on flashy violence, but on quiet, relentless economic and psychological pressure. He was both a brutal crime lord and a devoted family man, a ruthless predator and a shrewd businessman. His life forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable reality that the American dream, with its emphasis on ambition and success, can be perverted into a monstrously effective blueprint for criminal enterprise. The story of Carlos Marcello does not end with his death. It continues as a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of power and the enduring, haunting question of how deep the roots of shadow can grow when planted in the fertile soil of ambition and systemic weakness. He remains an enigma, a permanent resident of the grey area between myth and history, his final years serving as a poignant reminder that all empires, no matter how powerful or feared, are ultimately temporary. The true measure of Carlos Marcello's unprecedented control over his domain can perhaps best be understood not by the sheer volume of his illicit profits, but by the profound and lasting cultural and psychological imprint he left on the city of New Orleans and the state of Louisiana, an imprint that outlived his empire and continues to subtly influence the region's character long after his death. He was more than a criminal. He was a foundational, if dark, force in the modern shaping of the region, a shadow architect whose decisions, both violent and commercial, helped dictate the flow of capital, the nature of political power, and the very social fabric of communities for generations. His reign demonstrated a stark, alternative form of governance, one where justice was a commodity, protection was a service to be purchased, and loyalty was enforced not by law, but by a code of fear and favor. This created a unique social contract within his territory, a warped sense of order where the rules were clear to those who lived in his world. Cross the boss and face dire consequences, but play by his rules and you could operate with a strange form of security, insulated from both rival gangs and, most importantly, from the legitimate authorities who were on his payroll. For the ordinary citizen not involved in his rackets, his influence was felt in more subtle ways. In the politicians who were elected not by popular appeal but by his financial backing and his ability to deliver blocks of votes, in the police force that seemed to look the other way at certain crimes while zealously pursuing others, and in the local economy that was subtly propped up by the river of cash flowing from his gambling dens, prostitution rings, and loan sharking operations. This created a pervasive culture of cynicism and acceptance, a widespread understanding that the official structures of power were a facade, and that the real business of the city was conducted in the shadows. This legacy of corruption became, in a twisted way, part of the city's identity, a dirty secret that was often romanticized but whose practical consequences were a systemic weakening of public trust in institutions. Marcello's ability to operate with such brazen impunity for decades sent a clear message to the populace. The law was not blind, and it was not impartial. It was for sale, and the highest bidder was a quiet man in a tomato company. This erosion of faith in government and law enforcement is a poison that lingers, a cultural scar that can take generations to heal. Furthermore, his strategic focus on gambling and vice, as opposed to the more volatile drug trade of later eras, shaped the very nature of crime in the region, making it, for a time, a more stable, if deeply corrupt, environment. His model was one of consolidation and control, eliminating chaotic, independent operators and bringing all illicit activity under one corporate umbrella. This had the paradoxical effect of centralizing violence and corruption, making it more manageable and predictable for those within the system, while simultaneously making it more deeply entrenched and resistant to eradication. The physical landscape of New Orleans and its surrounding parishes was also shaped by his investments. The real estate he purchased, the businesses he fronted, and the bayous he developed for his hidden casinos all bore his invisible mark, a testament to how deeply a criminal enterprise can intertwine itself with the legitimate development of a community. His story is not just a biography of a man, but a case study in the sociology of power, a lesson in how a single individual, through a combination of ruthlessness, shrewd intelligence, and an innate understanding of human weakness, can bend the formal structures of society to his will, creating a parallel state that operates in plain sight yet remains just beyond the reach of conventional justice. The ghost of Carlos Marcello does not haunt New Orleans in the form of a spectre, but in the lingering whispers of a system where the lines between the criminal and the legitimate were not just crossed, but were systematically erased, leaving behind a legacy that questions the very nature of power and the fragility. Beyond the immediate sphere of his criminal and political machinations, the operational genius of Carlos Marcello was most vividly embodied in the sophisticated, almost corporate, financial architecture he constructed to launder and protect his immense fortune. A system so elaborate and effective that it became a model for modern money laundering and a constant, frustrating puzzle for federal investigators. The river of cash generated by his thousands of slot machines, his bustling handbook-making operations, and his exclusive high-stakes gambling sessions presented a monumental logistical challenge. How to transform millions of physically bulky, sequentially recorded dollar bills into clean, investable capital without triggering the scrutiny of the IRS or other federal agencies. His solution was a multi-layered, decentralized financial network that rivaled the complexity of a major corporation. The first step was the initial placement, where the small denomination, dirty cash was systematically gathered from across his territory by a fleet of couriers who would deliver it to counting houses, often located in the back rooms of his seemingly legitimate businesses like bars, restaurants, and vending machine companies. Here, the money would be counted, sorted, and prepared for the next stage. The second step, layering, was where Marcello's true ingenuity shone. He utilized a dizzying array of techniques to obscure the money's origin. A primary method was the use of shell companies and fronts. Businesses like the Pelican Tomato Company, jukebox and pinball machine distributorships, linen supply services, and real estate holding firms were perfect vehicles. They were cash-intensive by nature, allowing him to commingle his illicit profits with legitimate earnings seamlessly. He would create a web of interlocking companies, often registered in the names of trusted associates or family members, and then have them engage in a series of fictitious transactions, invoicing each other for services never rendered, creating a complex paper trail that made it nearly impossible for auditors to distinguish real revenue from criminal proceeds. Another crucial layer was his integration into the legitimate financial system through complicit or unwitting bankers. He would make regular, large cash deposits at various banks, but always in amounts just below the $10,000 threshold that would require the filing of a currency transaction report, a practice known as structuring or smurfing. The cash would then be wire transferred between accounts at different banks, both domestically and internationally, sometimes through Swiss or Caribbean banks that prized secrecy, further distancing the funds from their criminal source. The final stage, integration, involved injecting the now cleaned money back into the legitimate economy as what appeared to be legal profit. This was achieved through major investments in real estate, purchasing office buildings, apartment complexes, and vast tracts of land, which not only provided a respectable return on investment but also appreciable assets that could be used as collateral for legitimate loans, creating a virtuous cycle of wealth generation. His most ambitious integration project was his hidden investment in the Las Vegas casino industry, facilitated by loans from the Teamsters pension fund. By skimming a percentage of the casino's daily take before it was officially counted, a process that required the collaboration of corrupt casino managers and accountants, he and his partners were able to pull massive amounts of untaxed, untraceable cash directly from the heart of a legal business. This entire financial ecosystem was protected by a culture of omerta and a network of corrupt accountants and lawyers who knew how to navigate the edges of the tax code and banking laws. For decades, this system was impenetrable. The IRS and the FBI could see the results of his wealth, the properties, the businesses, the lavish lifestyles of his associates, but they could never successfully trace the river back to its source. It was only with the advent of the RICO statute, which allowed prosecutors to follow the money as a pattern of racketeering activity, and the evolution of sophisticated financial forensic techniques, that the walls finally began to close in on his financial fortress. The Brilab sting, which caught him discussing the bribery of a judge, was ultimately about corrupting the system to protect this very financial network. The fall of Carlos Marcello, therefore, was not just the fall of a mobster, but the fall of a financial visionary who had perfected the art of hiding in plain sight. A man who understood that in modern America, true power was not just measured in fear and violence, but in the silent, untraceable flow of capital through the veins of the legitimate economy. His legacy in the world of finance is a dark one. He wrote the playbook on large-scale money laundering that would be studied and emulated by criminal organizations for decades to come. The human cost of Carlos Marcello's empire, the shattered lives and blood-soaked foundations upon which his quiet wealth was built, forms the darkest and most indelible part of his legacy, a necessary counterpoint to the narrative of his shrewd business acumen and political cunning. For behind every silent partnership and every laundered dollar was the very real threat of brutal violence, a tool he deployed with chilling efficiency to enforce contracts, eliminate rivals, and maintain the absolute discipline that his vast criminal enterprise demanded. While he himself rarely, if ever, dirted his own hands, his orders, delivered in a quiet mumble or through a subtle gesture, were carried out with ruthless precision by a cadre of loyal enforcers who understood that failure was not an option. The swamps and bayous that he used for his hidden casinos also served as perfect, unmarked graves for those who crossed him. The victims of his reign were many and varied. Rival gangsters who attempted to muscle in on his territory were found shot in their cars, their bodies dumped on lonely rural roads. Associates who were suspected of skimming profits or talking to the authorities would simply vanish, their fates forever a subject of grim speculation. And even innocent bystanders who happened to witness the wrong thing at the wrong time could be eliminated as a simple matter of pragmatic business, a necessary cost of maintaining the silence that shielded his operations. This pervasive atmosphere of fear was the glue that held his empire together. It was not enough to bribe a politician. That politician also had to know the dire consequences of double-crossing the organization. It was not enough to cut a local sheriff in on the profits. He also had to understand that his family's safety depended on his continued cooperation. This dual strategy of bribery and intimidation was devastatingly effective. The violence was not random or chaotic. It was calculated, disciplined, and always served a strategic purpose. It was the dark engine of his corporate-like structure, the enforcement arm that guaranteed the terms of every crooked deal and protected the integrity of his illicit brand. One of the most notorious examples was the fate of potential witnesses in the various federal cases brought against him. Time and again, individuals who were prepared to testify against Marcello would suddenly change their stories, develop a severe case of amnesia on the witness stand, or, in more extreme cases, become unavailable altogether. The infamous unsolved murder of a key witness or the mysterious disappearance of a business partner was a powerful message to anyone else considering cooperation with the government. This strategy of witness intimidation was so successful that for the first 3 decades of his reign, securing a conviction against him was nearly impossible. Juries were notoriously difficult to seat, as potential jurors feared the repercussions of a guilty verdict. Those who did serve were often swayed by the climate of fear that permeated the city, understanding that acquittal was the safest path for themselves and their families. The human toll extended beyond the immediate victims of violence to the countless individuals and families whose lives were ruined by his core businesses. The illegal gambling operations preyed on the desperate and the addicted, draining paychecks and destroying savings. The loan sharking ring provided easy access to cash but at exorbitant interest rates, trapping borrowers in a cycle of debt from which escape was often impossible, sometimes leading to the loss of homes and businesses. The prostitution rings exploited vulnerable women, and the narcotics trade, which he later condoned, spread addiction and misery through communities. While Marcello presented a public image of a respectable family man, his private empire was built on a foundation of human suffering, a fact that was conveniently ignored by the powerful politicians and business leaders who enjoyed his hospitality and accepted his bribes. The blood that was spilled in the shadows of the French Quarter and the bayous was the true currency of his power, a stark reminder that for all his sophistication and quiet demeanor, Carlos Marcello was, at his core, a ruthless gangster whose immense wealth and influence were purchased with the lives and livelihoods of countless others. The paradoxical nature of Carlos Marcello's character, a man who embodied stark and seemingly irreconcilable contradictions, remains one of the most fascinating and elusive aspects of his legacy, presenting a figure who was neither a simplistic monster nor a romanticized anti-hero, but a complex human being whose life forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable gray areas of power, loyalty, and morality. To the outside world, and particularly to the federal authorities who pursued him, he was a cold, calculating criminal mastermind, a predator who corrupted everything he touched and whose name was synonymous with the darkest forms of organized crime. Yet, within the insulated confines of his own community and family, he was often perceived in a dramatically different light, as a generous benefactor, a man of his word, and a pillar of stability. This Jekyll and Hyde existence was not merely a facade but a fundamental part of his operational strategy and personal identity. In the Sicilian American neighborhoods of New Orleans, he was known to be approachable and even charitable. He would readily provide loans to families in distress, no questions asked, and was known to cover medical bills or funeral expenses for those who could not afford them. He operated on a strict, if twisted, code of honor where a handshake was considered a binding contract and loyalty was the highest virtue, a vestige of the old-world values his parents had brought from Sicily. This created a perverse form of social contract where many in his community saw him not as a menace, but as a protector and a provider, a man who looked after his own in a way that the distant and often discriminatory official government did not. This deep-seated local support was a significant factor in his longevity. It created a buffer of silence and loyalty that made it incredibly difficult for law enforcement to find willing witnesses or cooperative jurors. People were not just afraid of him, many were genuinely loyal to him, a loyalty born from a sense of shared identity and gratitude for his patronage. This duality extended to his personal life. By all accounts, he was a devoted husband to his wife, Jacqueline, and a caring father to his children. He actively discouraged his sons from entering his line of work, pushing them instead toward legitimate careers, a clear indication that he understood the damned nature of his own path. He lived not in opulent, gaudy splendor like some of his contemporaries, but in a comfortable, upper-middle-class home, valuing privacy and family above flamboyant displays of wealth. This modest personal lifestyle was both a personal preference and a strategic choice, allowing him to blend into the background and avoid unnecessary attention. Yet, this same man who could be so gentle with his grandchildren could, in the same afternoon, calmly order the execution of a business associate for a perceived betrayal, viewing it not as a murder but as a necessary corporate restructuring, the elimination of a liability. He compartmentalized his life with a psychologist's skill, separating the violence of his business from the tranquility of his home, a feat that required a profound and chilling disconnect. This ability to bifurcate his morality allowed him to be both a crime lord and a family man without apparent cognitive dissonance. He saw his criminal empire not as an evil enterprise, but as a business, one that happened to operate outside the restrictive and, in his view, unfair laws of the land. The politicians he bribed were, in his eyes, not corrupted but simply partners in a mutually beneficial transaction. The Kennedy administration's pursuit of him was not a quest for justice, but an unfair and personal vendetta by a privileged political family against a self-made man. This worldview, this ability to rationalize his actions within his own moral framework, was the key to his psyche. He was not a psychopath who reveled in violence. He was a pragmatist who used violence as a tool. He was not driven by a desire for notoriety, but by a deep-seated drive for power, security, and respect. The story of Carlos Marcello, therefore, is not a simple tale of good versus evil, but a much more complicated and unsettling story about the nature of power and the corrupting influence of absolute control. It is a story that challenges our desire for clear-cut villains and forces us to acknowledge that great evil can often be perpetrated not by cackling monsters, but by quiet, complex men who love their families, keep their word, and are capable of orchestrating immense human suffering without ever raising their voice or soiling their own hands. The technological and methodological arms race between Carlos Marcello's criminal organization and the federal agencies pursuing him, particularly the Federal Bureau of Investigation, represents a critical and often overlooked chapter in the history of American law enforcement. A clandestine war of wits and wiretaps that evolved dramatically over the course of his long career and ultimately provided the blueprint for his downfall. In the early days of his rise, Marcello operated in an environment where law enforcement tactics were relatively primitive, relying on physical surveillance, informants, and the occasional coerced confession. His defenses against these methods were straightforward but effective: a strict adherence to omerta, the Sicilian Code of Silence, a network of corrupt local police who would provide advance warning of any investigations, and a sophisticated system of counter-surveillance. His drivers were trained in evasive maneuvers, his meeting places were chosen for their privacy and multiple exits, and his communications were deliberately vague and often conducted in person to avoid the then rare threat of telephone wiretaps. For years, the FBI's attempts to penetrate his inner circle were futile. The fear of reprisal was too great, and the loyalty he inspired, whether through generosity or terror, was too strong. The first major shift in this battle came with the increasing sophistication and legal acceptance of electronic surveillance. The FBI began planting hidden microphones, or bugs, in his primary headquarters at the Pelican Tomato Company and other locations he frequented. This was a game changer. For the first time, agents could listen to the unfiltered, day-to-day operations of the boss himself. They heard him discussing the intricacies of his gambling operations, the distribution of political payoffs, and his frustrations with the Kennedys. These wiretaps provided an unprecedented, real-time window into the workings of a major crime family, but they also revealed the challenges of using this evidence. Marcello and his associates were careful, speaking in a coded language full of euphemisms. A murder was taking care of that thing, a political bribe was taking care of the flowers, and a problematic individual was a nut. Translating this coded chatter into admissible evidence was a monumental task. Furthermore, the legal standing of such surveillance was often on shaky ground, leading to protracted court battles over the admissibility of the evidence gathered. Marcello's side adapted in turn. He employed teams of technicians to sweep his offices for listening devices, he changed meeting locations frequently, and he began to rely more on trusted messengers for sensitive communications rather than telephones. The next great leap in the federal arsenal was the development of the Witness Protection Program and the increased use of major informants from within the Mafia itself. The Code of Omerta, which had been an impenetrable shield for generations, began to crack under the pressure of lengthy prison sentences and the promise of a new identity and life for cooperators and their families. While Marcello himself never faced a top-tier lieutenant turning against him, the very existence of this program changed the calculus for every member of his organization, introducing a seed of doubt and self-preservation that had not existed before. The final and most decisive technological and legal innovation was the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the RICO statute. This was not a new piece of surveillance technology, but a revolutionary legal one. It allowed prosecutors to connect disparate criminal acts, a murder in 1955, an extortion in 1965, a gambling operation in 1975, and present them as part of a single, ongoing criminal enterprise. This was the perfect tool for attacking Marcello, whose strength was his insulation from direct criminal acts. RICO allowed the government to prosecute the boss for the crimes he ordered, not just the crimes he committed. The evidence gathered from decades of wiretaps, now digitized and cross-referenced, could be woven into a single, devastating narrative of racketeering. The culmination was the Brilab Sting, an undercover operation of breathtaking audacity that combined old-fashioned infiltration with modern technology. An FBI informant, wearing a hidden recording device, posed as a businessman seeking to bribe a judge on Marcello's behalf. The conversations were captured on tape, providing irrefutable, first-hand evidence of the boss orchestrating a corruption scheme. This evidence, presented within the framework of a RICO indictment, was finally insurmountable. The long technological war, which had begun with agents in fedoras taking notes from across the street and evolved into a complex operation involving hidden microphones, wired informants, and forensic accounting, had reached its conclusion. The fall of Carlos Marcello was therefore not just the result of one case, but the product of a decades-long evolution in law enforcement strategy and technology, a testament to the relentless, if often painstakingly slow, adaptation of the American justice system to the challenge of sophisticated, entrenched organized crime. It proved that no criminal empire, no matter how powerful or well-insulated, could forever withstand the focus. The international dimensions of Carlos Marcello's criminal empire, often overshadowed by his domestic notoriety, reveal a figure whose reach and ambitions extended far beyond the bayous of Louisiana, positioning him as a significant player in a global network of illicit trade and clandestine alliances that connected the underworlds of multiple continents. His strategic location on the Gulf Coast provided him with a gateway to the world, and he exploited this with a visionary understanding of the opportunities presented by international waters and porous borders. Long before the term globalization entered the common lexicon, Marcello was operating a multinational criminal enterprise, with his most significant international ventures revolving around the Caribbean and Latin America. His involvement in the narcotics trade, while he publicly denied it and preferred to let others take the overt risks, was a cornerstone of this international expansion. Utilizing the same labyrinthine waterways he used for his gambling operations, he established sophisticated smuggling routes that moved heroin and cocaine from Mexico, Cuba, and later Colombia, through the isolated bayous and into the distribution networks of major American cities. This operation required intricate partnerships with foreign crime syndicates, including the powerful Corsican criminal networks in Marseille, who were key suppliers of heroin, and later, with emerging cartel figures in Mexico and South America. These were not mere supplier relationships, they were strategic alliances, involving complex negotiations over territories, transportation, and money laundering, all conducted with the quiet authority that was Marcello's trademark. His pre-revolutionary interests in Havana, Cuba, also illustrated his international scope. Along with fellow mobsters like Santo Trafficante Jr. and Maya Lansky, Marcello had a financial stake in the lucrative casino and hotel industry that flourished under the corrupt regime of Fulgencio Batista. The loss of these assets after Fidel Castro's communist revolution in 1959 was a significant financial blow and fueled his deep-seated antipathy towards the Castro regime, an antipathy that would later dovetail tragically with the interests of American intelligence. This connection to Cuba placed him at the heart of one of the most bizarre intersections of crime and espionage in the 20th century, the CIA Mafia plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. While the full extent of his personal involvement remains a subject of debate, his established relationships with Cuban exiles, his smuggling infrastructure through the Caribbean, and his partnership with Trafficante made him a logical, if dark, asset for a CIA desperate to eliminate the Cuban leader. The profound irony of the United States government seeking the services of a man it was simultaneously trying to imprison for racketeering was likely not lost on Marcello. It would have only reinforced his cynical worldview about the true nature of power and the hypocrisy of the institutions that opposed him. Beyond the Caribbean, his network had tentacles that reached into Europe and Canada, facilitating the movement of everything from illicit drugs to illegal immigrants, all generating massive profits that were then funneled through his sophisticated money laundering apparatus. This international activity demonstrated that Marcello was not a provincial crime lord, but a cosmopolitan criminal entrepreneur who understood that the future of organized crime lay in cross-border partnerships and the exploitation of international legal disparities. He was a pioneer in creating the template for the modern transnational criminal organization, a structure that would later be perfected by the drug cartels of the late 20th century. His ability to operate on this international stage, negotiating with foreign powers and managing complex logistics across thousands of miles, all while maintaining his iron grip on his home territory in New Orleans, stands as a testament to his exceptional organizational skills and his visionary, if wholly sinister, grasp of the emerging globalized landscape of crime. It paints a picture of a man whose ambitions were boundless, whose influence was international in scope, and whose legacy is inextricably linked not only to the story of American organized crime. The profound and complex relationship between Carlos Marcello and the city of New Orleans itself forms a central, symbiotic narrative in his story. A tale of a man and a place so perfectly suited to one another that it becomes impossible to imagine his rise occurring anywhere else, for the city's unique cultural, political, and geographical landscape provided the ideal petri dish for his particular brand of criminal enterprise to flourish and mutate into a shadow government. New Orleans was, and in many ways remains, a city apart from the rest of America, a place with a different history, a different rhythm, and a different relationship with authority. Founded as a French and Spanish colony where graft was not a corruption of the system but an integral part of its operation from the very beginning. This ingrained culture of corruption, combined with a deep-seated distrust of federal authority, created a political environment where Marcello's activities were not just tolerated but were often seen as part of the natural order. The city's geography, a sprawling urban center surrounded by a vast, impenetrable network of swamps, bayous, and waterways, was a tactical gift, providing endless hiding places for his casinos, his stills during Prohibition, and his narcotic smuggling operations, making it a logistical nightmare for outside law enforcement agencies to effectively patrol or investigate. The very social fabric of New Orleans, with its emphasis on pleasure, vice, and the celebration of the nocturnal, provided a ready-made clientele and a moral ambiguity that allowed his gambling, prostitution, and other rackets to operate with a level of social acceptance they would never have found in a more puritanical city. He was not an alien parasite feeding off a healthy host. He was a native growth, a product of the city's own unique ecosystem. He understood its people, its politics, and its peculiarities on an instinctual level. He spoke the local language, not just linguistically but culturally, knowing when to use a soft word and when to deploy a hard threat. He invested in the city not just financially but socially, becoming a part of its invisible infrastructure. In return, the city protected him. The same parochialism that made New Orleans wary of outsiders from Washington D.C. or even Baton Rouge extended to him. He was a local boy, and the federal agents were interlopers. This created a powerful buffer of silence and complicity. Jurors, drawn from the local population, were notoriously reluctant to convict him, not always out of fear, though that was a factor, but often out of a warped sense of local pride or a belief that his prosecution was an overreach by a distant, uncaring federal government. Local politicians, from the city council to the mayor's office, knew that his support could mean the difference between winning and losing an election, and his opposition could be politically fatal. This symbiotic relationship meant that for decades, Carlos Marcello was New Orleans, in a way that no elected official ever could be. He controlled its economy, its politics, and its underworld from his unassuming office, a silent partner in every major decision. The city's famous laissez-faire attitude, its let the good times roll philosophy, provided the perfect camouflage for his operations, allowing him to build his empire in plain sight, hidden behind a curtain of jazz, Mardi Gras beads, and the humid, decadent atmosphere of the French Quarter. His story is therefore inseparable from the story of New Orleans in the mid-20th century. To understand one is to understand the other. He was both a creator and a creation of his environment, a man who mastered the dark arts of his city so completely that he became its unofficial, UN-crowned king, ruling not from a palace, but from a tomato company, his power flowing through the city like the muddy waters of the Mississippi, unseen but omnipresent, shaping everything it touched. His eventual fall was not just the fall of a man, but the end of an era for the city itself. The role of family, both biological and criminal, served as the indispensable, dual-pillared foundation upon which Carlos Marcello built and sustained his empire, creating a structure of loyalty and obligation so powerful that it withstood external pressures for decades, forming a human fortress that proved almost as impenetrable as his financial and political defenses. Within the traditional, insular Sicilian-American community of New Orleans, blood ties were the ultimate currency of trust, and Marcello leveraged this to its fullest extent, placing his brothers, most notably Vincent and Joseph, in positions of significant authority within his organization, overseeing critical operations like gambling, loan sharking, and political liaison work. This was not merely nepotism. It was a strategic imperative. He knew that his family was bound to him by an unbreakable chain of blood and shared fate, making them the only individuals he could truly rely upon to never betray him to the authorities, for their own freedom and prosperity were inextricably linked to his. This biological nucleus was then extended outward into a vast, adopted family of sworn associates, soldiers, and capos who, through an oath of omerta, were bound to him with a fealty that was expected to surpass even their loyalty to their own country. This network functioned as a parallel society, with its own laws, its own system of justice, and its own economy, all orbiting the paternal figure of Marcello. He, in turn, operated as a classic padrino, a godfather in the most literal sense, dispensing favors, settling disputes, and providing for the welfare of his family members. If a soldier was imprisoned, his family would receive financial support. If a member needed a loan to start a business, Marcello would provide it. If a dispute arose between two associates, he would arbitrate it with final authority. This created a powerful, self-perpetuating cycle of debt and obligation that ensured loyalty was not just born from fear, but from a genuine, if twisted, sense of gratitude and belonging. This system was ruthlessly efficient in maintaining internal discipline and security. The threat of violence was always present for betrayal, but the rewards for loyalty were substantial, creating a climate where cooperation with law enforcement was seen as not just a personal failure, but a sacrilegious act against the entire clan. This explains why, for so long, the FBI found it nearly impossible to flip a high-level member of his organization. The social and cultural costs of becoming a stool pigeon were far higher than any prison sentence. The family structure also provided a resilient framework for succession and management. Marcello could delegate authority with confidence, knowing that the chain of command was clear and that his orders would be carried out with precision because they were filtered through a hierarchy built on decades of tested loyalty. This allowed his empire to operate smoothly even during his frequent absences due to legal troubles or his brief exile. The family was also his early warning system. Through his vast network of relatives and associates who owned businesses, worked in government, or operated in the underworld, he had eyes and ears in every corner of his territory, alerting him to potential threats from rivals or law enforcement long before they could materialize into a direct danger. This intricate web of familial and pseudo-familial bonds was the true engine of his longevity, the social glue that held his corporate-like criminal enterprise together. It was a system imported from the old world and perfected in the new, a structure that proved so effective that its basic principles of loyalty, silence, and paternalistic control would be studied and emulated by criminal organizations across the globe. The eventual unraveling of this structure began only when external pressures, the witness protection program, the threat of life imprisonment under RICO, became so immense that they began to outweigh the deeply ingrained cultural and personal bonds of the family. A slow-motion collapse that started with the cracks in omerta and ended with the patriarch himself, the once untouchable padrino, dying as a forgotten old man, his vast human fortress having slowly crumbled into dust around him, a poignant testament to the fact that even the most powerful and intricate of the mythology that has grown around the figure of Carlos Marcello in the decades since his death, a complex tapestry woven from verified facts, persistent rumors, and outright conspiracy theories, has transformed him from a historical crime figure into a near-legendary icon of American darkness, a symbolic vessel into which we pour our collective anxieties about power, corruption, and the hidden forces that shape our history. This process of myth-making began during his lifetime, fueled by the stark contrast between his public persona as a quiet businessman and the terrifying scope of his hidden power, a duality that captured the public imagination and spawned countless whispered stories about the true extent of his influence. His name became a local legend in New Orleans, a cautionary tale parents might tell their children, a shadowy explanation for any unexplained political outcome or sudden business failure. But it was his alleged connection to the assassination of President Kennedy that catapulted him from regional notoriety to national infamy, cementing his place in the dark pantheon of American history. This single, unproven allegation, supported by compelling circumstantial evidence of motive and opportunity, became the central, overwhelming fact of his posthumous reputation, overshadowing all his other criminal achievements and failures. In the vast and labyrinthine world of JFK assassination literature and film, Marcello is frequently portrayed not just as a suspect, but as a prime architect, the hidden hand that pulled the strings from his bayou throne room. This narrative, whether true or not, satisfies a deep human desire for explanation. It provides a clear, malevolent, and powerful cause for a chaotic and senseless national tragedy, an answer that is somehow more palatable than the idea of a lone, insignificant gunman altering the course of history. The mythology was further enriched by his alleged involvement in other shadowy chapters of history, such as the CIA's plots to kill Castro, creating a narrative of a man who moved effortlessly in the darkest corridors of both crime and espionage, a master of the underworld who held sway over the destinies of nations. This mythologized Marcello is a figure of almost supernatural cunning and reach, a symbol of a government and a society so corrupt that its most powerful institutions could be manipulated by a crime boss from New Orleans. The reality of the man, the pragmatic, corporate-minded, and often cautious criminal, has been largely subsumed by this larger-than-life legend. He has become a character in a national story we tell ourselves about the 60s, about the Mafia, about the death of Camelot. He represents the idea that the American dream has a dark, violent doppelganger, a shadow version where success is achieved not through hard work and virtue, but through brutality, corruption, and a ruthless understanding of human weakness. The ongoing debate among historians, journalists, and conspiracy theorists about his true role in the Kennedy assassination ensures that his myth remains alive and contested, a historical puzzle that will likely never be definitively solved. This eternal questioning guarantees his immortality, ensuring that the name Carlos Marcello will continue to be spoken and debated long after the names of his more flamboyant but less consequential contemporaries have faded from memory. He exists now not just as a man who lived and died, but as a powerful and enduring symbol, a permanent reminder of the unsettling possibility that the official version of history is incomplete, and that the true levers of power. The comparative analysis of Carlos Marcello's leadership style and criminal methodology against those of his contemporary mob bosses in other American cities reveals a unique and distinctly Southern approach to building and maintaining power, one that prioritized low-profile integration over flamboyant dominance and long-term political corruption over short-term violent gains, setting him apart as one of the most sophisticated and effectively insulated crime lords of his era. While figures like New York's Albert Anastasia or Chicago's Sam Giancana ruled through highly publicized displays of violence and intimidation, creating headlines and drawing the relentless focus of the press and federal agencies, Marcello operated on a fundamentally different principle, the power of quiet persuasion and systemic control. He understood that in the deeply entrenched and politically malleable environment of the South, true authority was not won in a hail of gunfire on a city street, but through the patient, methodical corruption of the very institutions designed to stop him. Where Anastasia's Murder Incorporated was a blunt instrument of terror, Marcello's organization was a finely tuned instrument of economic and political influence. He avoided the internecine wars that crippled the New York families and brought down so many of their leaders, preferring instead to consolidate his territory through strategic alliances and business arrangements that minimized bloodshed and, consequently, law enforcement attention. His base of operations, the unassuming Pelican Tomato Company, stood in stark contrast to the social clubs and lavish nightclubs favored by northern bosses, reflecting his core philosophy that invisibility was the ultimate defense. This was not a man who sought the spotlight, he sought the ledger book and the backroom deal. His alliance with Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters Union was a masterstroke that gave him a financial reach comparable to any New York family, but it was managed with a discretion that his northern counterparts often lacked. While the feds were wiretapping flashy mob summits in Appalachian, New York, Marcello was conducting his business through a network of seemingly legitimate enterprises and corrupted public officials, a structure that was far more difficult to penetrate. His approach to violence was also markedly different. It was not a first resort but a final one, deployed with surgical precision rather than as a weapon of mass intimidation. This calculated restraint allowed him to maintain a public image that bordered on respectable, enabling his deep infiltration of the political fabric of Louisiana and beyond. Unlike the ostentatious Giancana, who was a known associate of Frank Sinatra and a fixture in celebrity circles, Marcello cultivated an image of a humble businessman, making him a less appealing target for federal prosecutors who often pursued the most visible and egotistical figures first. His focus on gambling, prostitution, and loan sharking, traditional rackets with deep roots in the local culture, was also a strategic choice. While he certainly profited from narcotics, he was shrewd enough to keep his direct involvement at arm's length, understanding the uniquely severe legal penalties and intense federal scrutiny that the drug trade attracted. This caution allowed him to avoid the devastating narcotics convictions that ended the careers of so many other mob leaders. In essence, Carlos Marcello was the corporate CEO of the American Mafia, a bureaucratic boss who understood that sustainable power in the 20th century came not from the barrel of a gun, but from the control of capital, the corruption of the political process, and the meticulous maintenance of a benign public facade. His empire was built to endure, not to impress, and its very quietness was its greatest strength, allowing it to grow and metastasize within the body politic of an entire region for decades, largely unchecked, until the unique and personal vendetta of the Kennedy administration, followed by the revolutionary legal tool of RICO, finally provided the means to attack an enemy that had proven immune to all conventional forms of law enforcement. His legacy, therefore, is not one of iconic notoriety, but of a deeper, more insidious form of success. He was the mob boss who came closer than any other to perfecting the art of ruling. The intricate and often deliberately obscured relationship between Carlos Marcello and the world of legitimate business and finance stands as a testament to his forward-thinking vision, demonstrating a clear understanding that the future of criminal enterprise lay not in overt domination of the underworld, but in the silent, seamless integration of illicit capital into the mainstream economy, thereby creating a self-perpetuating cycle of wealth and influence that was largely immune to traditional law enforcement tactics. While the profits from his gambling halls and street-level rackets were the initial seed capital, Marcello's true genius was demonstrated in his strategic deployment of these millions into a diverse and sprawling portfolio of legitimate enterprises, a process that served the dual purpose of laundering his money and building a public persona of a successful, respectable entrepreneur. His investments were carefully chosen for their cash-intensive nature and their ability to facilitate his criminal logistics. The Pelican Tomato Company was the perfect front. The constant flow of produce-laden trucks provided a plausible explanation for the movement of men and money, while the business itself generated legitimate earnings to commingle with the illegal proceeds from his rackets. Beyond this iconic front, his holdings expanded into a vast and seemingly unconnected network of businesses, jukebox and vending machine distributorships, which placed him at the nexus of the cash-based entertainment industry, linen supply services for hotels and restaurants, real estate development firms that acquired commercial properties and vast tracts of land, and even interests in the burgeoning oil and gas industry along the Gulf Coast. Each of these ventures was a cog in a larger financial machine. The real estate holdings, in particular, were a masterstroke, providing not only a steady stream of rental income and long-term capital appreciation, but also offering immense opportunities for collateral-based lending from legitimate financial institutions. He would use a property purchased with dirty money as security for a clean, bank-loaned mortgage, effectively transforming untouchable cash into a legally recognized and spendable asset. This complex web of interlocking companies, often registered under the names of associates and family members, created a labyrinthine corporate veil that made it nearly impossible for IRS agents or FBI accountants to trace the ultimate ownership and source of funds. His most ambitious foray into the legitimate economy, however, was his hidden investment in the Las Vegas casino industry, facilitated by his alliance with Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters pension fund. By securing multi-million-dollar loans from the fund, Marcello and his associates gained a silent but substantial stake in several key casinos on the Strip. The skimming operations that followed were the pinnacle of his financial criminality. Corrupt casino managers would siphon off a portion of the daily cash take before it was ever counted for tax purposes, funneling it directly to the crime families back in the Midwest and the South. This operation was a perfect closed loop. Teamster pension funds, filled with the dues of working men and women, were loaned to build the casinos. The casinos then generated massive, untaxed, and untraceable profits that were secretly diverted back to the very mobsters who controlled the loans. It was a scheme of breathtaking audacity and complexity, one that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of high finance that rivaled any Wall Street executive. This seamless blending of the legitimate and the illicit allowed Marcello to build a fortune that was not only immense but also incredibly durable. While law enforcement could occasionally disrupt a gambling ring or arrest a bookmaker, they could not easily dismantle his real estate empire or unravel the complex financial transactions that stretched across state lines and international borders. His wealth became a hidden fortress, its walls built not of stone and mortar, but of corporate charters, property deeds, and financial instruments, protecting him and ensuring that even if his operational control was challenged, his financial power would endure, providing the resources to fight endless legal battles and maintain his influence from the shadows. This strategic focus on financial integration over brute force marks Carlos Marcello as a proto-modern criminal, a pioneer who understood that in the second half of the 20th century, the most secure and powerful criminal empire would be the one that looked. The gradual and irreversible decline of Carlos Marcello's physical and mental faculties in his final years stands as a profound and deeply ironic coda to a life defined by relentless ambition, fierce intelligence, and an almost superhuman capacity for control. A cruel twist of fate that saw the very tools which built his empire, his sharp mind and formidable will, systematically dismantled by the impersonal forces of age and disease, leaving behind a hollowed shell of the man who had once commanded an underworld. This internal collapse began even before his final imprisonment, as the accumulated stress of decades of legal battles, constant surveillance, and the immense pressure of managing a vast criminal enterprise in the face of an increasingly sophisticated federal assault began to take its toll. The once impenetrable calm that had allowed him to stare down Senate investigators and outmaneuver rivals began to show hairline fractures, replaced by a growing irritability and a deepening paranoia that even his extensive network of corrupt officials and loyal soldiers could no longer fully shield him from the consequences of his actions. His 1981 RICO conviction and subsequent life sentence, while a legal and professional death knell, also served as a catastrophic accelerant for his physical decline. The transition from the quiet, if tense, comfort of his Metairie home to the sterile, regimented, and inherently violent environment of a federal penitentiary was a shock his aging system was ill-equipped to handle. The vibrant, sensory-rich world of New Orleans, the humid air, the rich food, the whispered conversations in dark corners, was replaced by the monotonous, concrete reality of a prison cell, a deprivation that eroded his spirit as much as his body. It was within these confines that the first unmistakable signs of dementia began to manifest. A cruel thief that started by stealing recent memories and then worked its way backward through a lifetime of secrets and strategies. The man who had once held the intricate financial details of a multi-state empire in his head could now struggle to recall the events of the previous day. The boss who had negotiated complex alliances with a subtle nod or a coded phrase now found his words becoming tangled, his thoughts drifting mid-sentence. This cognitive unraveling was the ultimate defeat, a humiliation far greater than any prison sentence. The federal bureaucracy, having finally captured its prize, was now faced with the costly and inconvenient reality of an elderly, infirm prisoner who was no longer the fearsome kingpin of legend but a sick old man requiring constant medical care. His lawyers, in a final, desperate service, successfully argued for his release in 1989 on humanitarian grounds, securing his return to Louisiana not as a triumphant homecoming, but as a medical evacuation. The city he returned to was one he could no longer recognize or comprehend. The political landscape had changed, his old haunts had been redeveloped, and the underworld had been fractured and reconfigured by new, more volatile forces. He spent his final years confined to his home, a prisoner now of his own failing body and mind, surrounded by family but isolated from the world he had once shaped. The flow of visitors, once a who's who of corrupt officials and aspiring gangsters, dwindled to a trickle of immediate family and caretakers. The fear and respect he had commanded for half a century evaporated, replaced by the pity reserved for the enfeebled. His death in 1993, from a heart attack, was in many ways an administrative formality. The Carlos Marcello of history, the strategic criminal genius, had already ceased to exist years earlier, his empire and his mind having crumbled in a tragic, simultaneous collapse. This ignoble end serves as a stark, universal reminder of the ultimate fragility of all power, a lesson that no amount of wealth, influence, or notoriety can indefinitely postpone the inevitable decay. The enduring legal and historical debates surrounding the life and legacy of Carlos Marcello, particularly concerning the limits of evidence, the nature of conspiracy, and the challenges of ascribing definitive historical truth to events shrouded in intentional secrecy and deliberate obfuscation, have ensured that his story remains an open wound in the American consciousness, a complex puzzle that continues to generate more questions than answers and serves as a permanent fixture in the study of 20th century crime and power. The central, and ultimately unanswerable, question of his involvement in the assassination of President Kennedy exemplifies this dilemma, pitting the compelling, logic-driven narrative of motive and opportunity against the steadfast absence of a judicial smoking gun. Prosecutors and historians who argue for his guilt point to an overwhelming circumstantial case. He had expressed a visceral, murderous hatred for the president and his brother, the Attorney General, on FBI wiretaps. He possessed the sophisticated national network necessary to facilitate such a plot. He had a documented history of using nuts or patsies to carry out crimes. And the assassination had the direct effect of removing his primary persecutor from power. This interpretation paints a picture of a cold, pragmatic business decision taken to its most extreme and terrifying conclusion. Yet, the counter-argument, one upheld by the strict standards of the American judicial system, remains. Without a direct, corroborated witness or a piece of irrefutable physical evidence placing him at the center of the plot, his guilt cannot be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. This legal technicality, however, does little to quell the historical suspicion, creating a schism between the court of law and the court of public opinion that has kept the controversy alive for decades. Beyond the Kennedy assassination, his legacy is debated on other fronts. Was he a traditional, old-world mafia don, Or was he a modern criminal innovator who understood the shifting landscape of American power better than his peers? The evidence supports both views. His reliance on family, his adherence to omerta, and his roots in the Sicilian immigrant experience are classic traits of the traditional Godfather. Yet, his corporate structure, his focus on political corruption over street-level violence, and his pioneering use of financial instruments for money laundering were decidedly modern, pointing toward a new model of organized crime that would fully emerge in the decades after his fall. Historians also debate the true source of his resilience. Was it the unique corruption of Louisiana that allowed him to flourish, or was it his personal genius for manipulation that corrupted the state? This chicken and egg question lies at the heart of understanding his empire. He and his environment were so perfectly matched that it becomes impossible to disentangle the man from the corrupt system that enabled him. Furthermore, the ongoing declassification of government documents, particularly from the CIA and FBI, continues to fuel new theories and reinterpretations of his role in events like the Castro plots, ensuring that the historical record remains fluid and contested. Each new file release prompts a fresh wave of analysis, with scholars and researchers sifting through heavily redacted pages for any hint of a previously unknown connection or a confirmed meeting. This process guarantees that Carlos Marcello will not be easily relegated to a closed chapter of history. He remains a live subject of inquiry, a figure whose full story may never be completely told because the very nature of his power depended on leaving no clear record. The debates surrounding him are about more than just one man's crimes. They are debates about the nature of evidence itself when dealing with a secretive criminal conspiracy, about the limits of historical knowledge when key actors take their secrets to the grave, and about our own perpetual fascination with the idea of hidden forces shaping our public world. In the end, Carlos Marcello has achieved a form of immortality, not through honor or noble deeds, but by becoming an eternal subject of what if, a permanent and unsettling question mark in the American story, a shadow that, despite the best efforts of journalists, the cultural and artistic interpretations of Carlos Marcello's life and legend, as filtered through the lenses of literature, film, and television, have played a pivotal role in shaping the public's perception of the man, often blurring the lines between historical fact and dramatic fiction and transforming him from a specific individual into a broader archetype of the modern crime lord. Unlike the more flamboyant and publicly known gangsters of his era, Marcello's inherent secrecy and preference for the shadows made him a less immediately accessible figure for popular culture, leading creators to often use him as a template or an inspiration rather than depicting him directly. His influence is palpable in the portrayal of powerful, behind-the-scenes mafia bosses who rule not through loud intimidation but through quiet authority and political corruption. Characters who understand that the real power lies not in the streets but in the halls of government and the ledgers of business. The most direct and significant cultural footprint he left, however, is inextricably linked to the JFK assassination conspiracy genre. In countless books, documentaries, and dramatic films, from Oliver Stone's controversial JFK to a myriad of television specials, Marcello is frequently positioned as a prime suspect, the shadowy architect of the century's most infamous crime. These portrayals, while often speculative, have seared his image into the public consciousness as the man who may have killed a president, an allegation that has become the defining, if unproven, element of his popular legacy. This narrative is compelling because it fits a classic dramatic structure, a powerful, wronged king in his underworld kingdom striking back at the shining knight who sought to destroy him. Beyond the assassination narratives, the very setting of his empire, the humid, decadent, and morally ambiguous atmosphere of New Orleans, has provided a rich backdrop for fictionalized accounts of organized crime, from crime novels to television series, where characters clearly modeled on Marcello pull the strings from unassuming storefronts and restaurants, their power hidden beneath a veneer of southern charm and normalcy. These artistic interpretations, while taking creative liberties, often capture the essential truth of his power base, that it was rooted in the systemic corruption of a unique American city. Furthermore, his complex character, the quiet family man who is also a ruthless criminal, offers a rich duality for storytellers to explore, a complexity that makes him a more intriguing and psychologically nuanced figure than a simple thug. The calm, almost placid demeanor he presented to the world, which concealed a fierce and calculating intellect, is a character trait that writers and actors have repeatedly mined for its dramatic potential. However, this process of cultural myth-making comes with a cost. The nuanced, historically documented facts of his life, his sophisticated business acumen, his intricate money laundering schemes, his deliberate avoidance of the narcotics trade, are often glossed over in favor of the more sensational and cinematic aspects of his story, particularly the alleged presidential assassination plot. The real Carlos Marcello, the corporate-style boss of the Gulf Coast, risks being entirely replaced in the public imagination by the mythical Marcello, the king of the bayou who dared to challenge the throne of American power. This transformation from man to myth ensures his story will continue to be told, but it also ensures that the full, complicated truth of his empire may forever be subordinate to the more potent and enduring power of a well-told legend, a fate that would likely have both amused and irritated the intensely private man who spent his entire life trying to control his own narrative and who ultimately, and perhaps the final, sobering assessment of Carlos Marcello's life and the ultimate fate of his criminal empire forces a confrontation with the ephemeral nature of all power structures built upon a foundation of fear, corruption, and violence, revealing a legacy that, while historically significant, is one of profound transience and moral bankruptcy when viewed through the long lens of time. The vast, intricate network he painstakingly constructed over 5 decades, a web of political protectors, economic interests, and loyal soldiers, proved to be astonishingly fragile once its central pillar was removed, disintegrating with a speed that betrayed the shallow roots of its authority. His conviction and imprisonment did not simply result in a change of management. It triggered the rapid and irreversible dissolution of his kingdom. Without his strategic mind to mediate disputes, his personal relationships to maintain political cover, and his fearsome reputation to enforce discipline, the coalition of interests that comprised his empire quickly fractured into competing factions, each vying for control of the remnants. The younger generation of criminals, lacking the patience and strategic vision of the old guard, turned to the more immediately profitable but infinitely more dangerous drug trade, attracting a level of federal scrutiny that Marcello had wisely avoided and leading to a new wave of violence and convictions that further eroded the organization's coherence. The political climate of Louisiana also evolved, slowly and imperfectly, toward a marginally more accountable system where the brazen, cash-on-the-barrelhead corruption he had mastered became increasingly risky for both the giver and the receiver. The city of New Orleans, the cradle of his power, began to reinvent itself, and the shadow he cast over its institutions gradually receded, replaced by new, more diffuse forms of criminality and a growing recognition that the old ways were a stain on the city's potential. The physical landmarks of his reign were bulldozed or repurposed, and the name Marcello, once whispered with a mixture of fear and respect, began to fade from common memory, known only to historians, true crime enthusiasts, and those old enough to remember when a quiet man in a tomato company held the life of the city in his hands. His personal fortune, once believed to be immense and untouchable, was largely dissipated by legal fees, government seizures, and the costs of his final years, leaving no lasting dynasty of legitimate wealth for his descendants. The ultimate irony of his life is that the very things he valued most, control, respect, and legacy, are the very things that evaporated most completely upon his exit from the stage. He sought to build an enduring criminal corporation, but he succeeded only in creating a personal fiefdom that could not survive his own downfall. He craved respect, but history will forever remember him primarily as a suspect in a national tragedy, a man whose name is synonymous with conspiracy and murder. He desired a legacy of power, but what remains is a cautionary tale about the limits of illicit ambition. In the end, the story of Carlos Marcello is not one of triumphant power, but of its ultimate hollowness. It is a story that demonstrates with brutal clarity that an empire built on sand, no matter how imposing its facade, cannot withstand the tides of time, justice, and change. His life stands as a powerful, if grim, testament to the fact that while corruption can yield immense short-term power, it offers no foundation for anything lasting, and that the pursuit of power through fear and criminality ultimately leads not to immortality, but to obscurity, and not to a legacy of honor, but to a footnote in history marked by violence, suspicion, and the enduring question of what might have been had such formidable intellect and relentless. And so, the story of Carlos Marcello concludes not with the dramatic finality of a gunshot, but with the slow, inexorable fading of a shadow, a gradual retreat into the murky depths of the history from which he emerged, leaving behind a legacy that is less a monument to his power and more a permanent cautionary stain on the American narrative, a complex and troubling reminder of the fragility of our institutions and the profound consequences that arise when ambition is completely divorced from morality. His journey from an illegal immigrant child in the Sicilian enclaves of New Orleans to the undisputed master of a multi-state criminal corporation is a dark perversion of the American dream, a testament to how the very qualities of determination, business acumen, and relentless drive that can build great fortunes and nations can, when channeled into the void of the underworld, create an empire of corruption that cripples the soul of a city and forever alters the course of a nation's history. He was a man of his time and place, a product of a specific environment of ingrained political graft and social isolation that provided the perfect fertile ground for his unique talents to take root and flourish. Yet he was also a visionary who transcended his origins, pioneering criminal business models and financial laundering techniques that would be studied and emulated for generations. The unanswered questions that swirl around his life, particularly his alleged role in the assassination of a president, ensure that he will never be relegated to a simple, closed chapter in a history book, but will instead remain a ghost at the feast of American history, a permanent symbol of the unresolved traumas and hidden conspiracies that lurk just beneath the polished surface of our national story. His rise demonstrated the vulnerabilities of a system that could be so thoroughly compromised from within. His peak showed the staggering heights of influence a criminal could achieve when operating with patience and intelligence, and his fall revealed the relentless, if often slow-moving, machinery of justice that eventually, inevitably, grinds down even the most powerful and insulated of its targets. The city of New Orleans, the true love and accomplice of his life, eventually moved on, healing its wounds and building a new identity. Yet the ghost of his control, the memory of his invisible government, remains a part of its DNA, a lesson in the price of corruption that is passed down like a whispered folktale. In the final accounting, Carlos Marcello was neither a monster nor a hero, but a profoundly human figure whose immense flaws and terrifying ambitions hold up a dark mirror to our own society, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the line between the respectable businessman and the ruthless crime lord can sometimes be vanishingly thin, and that the allure of power, in all its forms, is a force that can corrupt absolutely. His life stands as an eternal warning, a chilling echo from the past that reminds us that the greatest threats to our democracy are not always external, but can grow like a cancer from within, nurtured by apathy, greed, and the cynical belief that every man and every institution has its price. The humid air of New Orleans may have long since dissipated his physical presence, but the chilling lesson of his reign endures, a silent, sobering testament to the enduring battle between light and shadow, between law and chaos, and between the America we aspire to be and the dark reflections that sometimes, terrifyingly, we become. The story of Carlos Marcello is a chilling chapter in the annals of American history, a tale of immense power built in the shadows and a legacy forever intertwined with national tragedy. We have journeyed from the sweltering bayous of Louisiana to the halls of power in Washington, tracing the rise and fall of a man who believed he was above the law. If this deep dive into the hidden mechanisms of power has captivated you, if you find yourself intrigued by these complex figures who shaped our world from the darkness, then your journey does not have to end here. The channel is a repository of such stories, each one meticulously researched and narrated to bring you the unvarnished truth. To ensure you don't miss our next exploration into the forgotten, the mysterious, and the outright shocking, please show your support. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you can join us as we continue to uncover the secrets of the past. The cultural and artistic interpretations of Carlos Marcello's life and legend, as filtered through the lenses of literature, film, and television, have played a pivotal role in shaping the public's perception of the man, often blurring the lines between historical fact and dramatic fiction and transforming him from a specific individual into a broader archetype of the modern crime lord. Unlike the more flamboyant and publicly known gangsters of his era, Marcello's inherent secrecy and preference for the shadows made him a less immediately accessible figure for popular culture, leading creators to often use him as a template or an inspiration rather than depicting him directly. His influence is palpable in the portrayal of powerful, behind-the-scenes mafia bosses who rule not through loud intimidation but through quiet authority and political corruption. Characters who understand that the real power lies not in the streets but in the halls of government and the ledgers of business. The most direct and significant cultural footprint he left, however, is inextricably linked to the JFK Assassination Conspiracy genre. In countless books, documentaries, and dramatic films, from Oliver Stone's controversial JFK to a myriad of television specials, Marcello is frequently positioned as a prime suspect, the shadowy architect of the century's most infamous crime. These portrayals, while often speculative, have seared his image into the public consciousness as the man who may have killed a president, an allegation that has become the defining, if unproven, element of his popular legacy. This narrative is compelling because it fits a classic dramatic structure, a powerful, wronged king in his underworld kingdom striking back at the shining knight who sought to destroy him. Beyond the assassination narratives, the very setting of his empire, the humid, decadent, and morally ambiguous atmosphere of New Orleans, has provided a rich backdrop for fictionalized accounts of organized crime, from crime novels to television series. where characters clearly modeled on Marcello pull the strings from unassuming storefronts and restaurants, their power hidden beneath a veneer of southern charm and normalcy. These artistic interpretations, while taking creative liberties, often capture the essential truth of his power base, that it was rooted in the systemic corruption of a unique American city. Furthermore, his complex character, the quiet family man who was also a ruthless criminal, offers a rich duality for storytellers to explore, a complexity that makes him a more intriguing and psychologically nuanced figure than a simple thug. The calm, almost placid demeanor he presented to the world, which concealed a fierce and calculating intellect, is a character trait that writers and actors have repeatedly mined for its dramatic potential. However, this process of cultural myth-making comes with a cost. The nuanced, historically documented facts of his life, his sophisticated business acumen, his intricate money laundering schemes, his deliberate avoidance of the narcotics trade, are often glossed over in favor of the more sensational and cinematic aspects of his story, particularly the alleged presidential assassination plot. The real Carlos Marcello, the corporate-style boss of the Gulf Coast, risks being entirely replaced in the public imagination by the mythical Marcello, the king of the bayou who dared to challenge the throne of American power. This transformation from man to myth ensures his story will continue to be told, but it also ensures that the full, complicated truth of his empire may forever be subordinate to the more potent and enduring power of a well-told legend, a fate that would likely have both amused and irritated the intensely private man who spent his entire life trying to control his own narrative and who ultimately, and perhaps the final, sobering assessment of Carlos Marcello's life and the ultimate fate of his criminal empire forces a confrontation with the ephemeral nature of all power structures built upon a foundation of fear, corruption, and violence, revealing a legacy that, while historically significant, is one of profound transience and moral bankruptcy when viewed through the long lens of time. The vast, intricate network he painstakingly constructed over 5 decades, a web of political protectors, economic interests, and loyal soldiers, proved to be astonishingly fragile once its central pillar was removed, disintegrating with a speed that betrayed the shallow roots of its authority. His conviction and imprisonment did not simply result in a change of management. It triggered the rapid and irreversible dissolution of his kingdom. Without his strategic mind to mediate disputes, his personal relationships to maintain political cover, and his fearsome reputation to enforce discipline, the coalition of interests that comprised his empire quickly fractured into competing factions, each vying for control of the remnants. The younger generation of criminals, lacking the patience and strategic vision of the old guard, turned to the more immediately profitable but infinitely more dangerous drug trade, attracting a level of federal scrutiny that Marcello had wisely avoided and leading to a new wave of violence and convictions that further eroded the organization's coherence. The political climate of Louisiana also evolved, slowly and imperfectly, toward a marginally more accountable system where the brazen, cash-on-the-barrelhead corruption he had mastered became increasingly risky for both the giver and the receiver. The city of New Orleans, the cradle of his power, began to reinvent itself, and the shadow he cast over its institutions gradually receded, replaced by new, more diffuse forms of criminality and a growing recognition that the old ways were a stain on the city's potential. The physical landmarks of his reign were bulldozed or repurposed, and the name Marcello, once whispered with a mixture of fear and respect, began to fade from common memory, known only to historians, true crime enthusiasts, and those old enough to remember when a quiet man in a tomato company held the life of the city in his hands. His personal fortune, once believed to be immense and untouchable, was largely dissipated by legal fees, government seizures, and the costs of his final years, leaving no lasting dynasty of legitimate wealth for his descendants. The ultimate irony of his life is that the very things he valued most, control, respect, and legacy, are the very things that evaporated most completely upon his exit from the stage. He sought to build an enduring criminal corporation, but he succeeded only in creating a personal fiefdom that could not survive his own downfall. He craved respect, but history will forever remember him primarily as a suspect in a national tragedy, a man whose name is synonymous with conspiracy and murder. He desired a legacy of power, but what remains is a cautionary tale about the limits of illicit ambition. In the end, the story of Carlos Marcello is not one of triumphant power, but of its ultimate hollowness. It is a story that demonstrates with brutal clarity that an empire built on sand, no matter how imposing its facade, cannot withstand the tides of time, justice, and change. His life stands as a powerful, if grim, testament to the fact that while corruption can yield immense short-term power, it offers no foundation for anything lasting, and that the pursuit of power through fear and criminality ultimately leads not to immortality, but to obscurity, and not to a legacy of honor. but to a footnote in history marked by violence, suspicion, and the enduring question of what might have been had such formidable intellect and relentless. And so, the story of Carlos Marcello concludes not with the dramatic finality of a gunshot, but with the slow, inexorable fading of a shadow, a gradual retreat into the murky depths of the history from which he emerged, leaving behind a legacy that is less a monument to his power and more a permanent cautionary stain on the American narrative, a complex and troubling reminder of the fragility of our institutions and the profound consequences that arise when ambition is completely divorced from morality. His journey from an illegal immigrant child in the Sicilian enclaves of New Orleans to the undisputed master of a multi-state criminal corporation is a dark perversion of the American dream, a testament to how the very qualities of determination, business acumen, and relentless drive that can build great fortunes and nations can, when channeled into the void of the underworld, create an empire of corruption that cripples the soul of a city and forever alters the course of a nation's history. He was a man of his time and place, a product of a specific environment of ingrained political graft and social isolation that provided the perfect fertile ground for his unique talents to take root and flourish. Yet he was also a visionary who transcended his origins, pioneering criminal business models and financial laundering techniques that would be studied and emulated for generations. The unanswered questions that swirl around his life, particularly his alleged role in the assassination of a president, ensure that he will never be relegated to a simple, closed chapter in a history book, but will instead remain a ghost at the feast of American history, a permanent symbol of the unresolved traumas and hidden conspiracies that lurk just beneath the polished surface of our national story. His rise demonstrated the vulnerabilities of a system that could be so thoroughly compromised from within. His peak showed the staggering heights of influence a criminal could achieve when operating with patience and intelligence, and his fall revealed the relentless, if often slow-moving, machinery of justice that eventually, inevitably, grinds down even the most powerful and insulated of its targets. The city of New Orleans, the true love and accomplice of his life, eventually moved on, healing its wounds and building a new identity. Yet the ghost of his control, the memory of his invisible government, remains a part of its DNA, a lesson in the price of corruption that is passed down like a whispered folktale. In the final accounting, Carlos Marcello was neither a monster nor a hero, but a profoundly human figure whose immense flaws and terrifying ambitions hold up a dark mirror to our own society, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the line between the respectable businessman and the ruthless crime lord can sometimes be vanishingly thin, and that the allure of power, in all its forms, is a force that can corrupt absolutely. His life stands as an eternal warning, a chilling echo from the past that reminds us that the greatest threats to our democracy are not always external, but can grow like a cancer from within, nurtured by apathy, greed, and the cynical belief that every man and every institution has its price. The humid air of New Orleans may have long since dissipated his physical presence, but the chilling lesson of his reign endures, a silent, sobering testament to the enduring battle between light and shadow, between law and chaos, and between the America we aspire to be and the dark reflections that sometimes, terrifyingly, we become. The story of Carlos Marcello is a chilling chapter in the annals of American history, a tale of immense power built in the shadows and a legacy forever intertwined with national tragedy. We have journeyed from the sweltering bayous of Louisiana to the halls of power in Washington, tracing the rise and fall of a man who believed he was above the law. If this deep dive into the hidden mechanisms of power has captivated you, if you find yourself intrigued by these complex figures who shaped our world from the darkness, then your journey does not have to end here. The channel is a repository of such stories, each one meticulously researched and narrated to bring you the unvarnished truth. To ensure you don't miss our next exploration into the forgotten, the mysterious, and the outright shocking, please show your support. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you can join us as we continue to uncover the secrets of the past. And so, the story of Carlos Marcello concludes not with the dramatic finality of a gunshot, but with the slow, inexorable fading of a shadow, a gradual retreat into the murky depths of the history from which he emerged, leaving behind a legacy that is less a monument to his power and more a permanent cautionary stain on the American narrative, a complex and troubling reminder of the fragility of our institutions and the profound consequences that arise when ambition is completely divorced from morality. His journey from an illegal immigrant child in the Sicilian enclaves of New Orleans to the undisputed master of a multi-state criminal corporation is a dark perversion of the American dream, a testament to how the very qualities of determination, business acumen, and relentless drive that can build great fortunes and nations can, when channeled into the void of the underworld, Create an empire of corruption that cripples the soul of a city and forever alters the course of a nation's history. He was a man of his time and place, a product of a specific environment of ingrained political graft and social isolation that provided the perfect fertile ground for his unique talents to take root and flourish. Yet he was also a visionary who transcended his origins, pioneering criminal business models and financial laundering techniques that will be studied and emulated for generations. The unanswered questions that swirl around his life, particularly his alleged role in the assassination of a president, ensure that he will never be relegated to a simple, closed chapter in a history book, but will instead remain a ghost at the feast of American history, a permanent symbol of the unresolved traumas and hidden conspiracies that lurk just beneath the polished surface of our national story. His rise demonstrated the vulnerabilities of a system that could be so thoroughly compromised from within. His peak showed the staggering heights of influence a criminal could achieve when operating with patience and intelligence, and his fall revealed the relentless, if often slow-moving, machinery of justice that eventually, inevitably, grinds down even the most powerful and insulated of its targets. The city of New Orleans, the true love and accomplice of his life, eventually moved on, healing its wounds and building a new identity. Yet the ghost of his control, the memory of his invisible government, remains a part of its DNA, a lesson in the price of corruption that is passed down like a whispered folktale. In the final accounting, Carlos Marcello was neither a monster nor a hero, but a profoundly human figure whose immense flaws and terrifying ambitions hold up a dark mirror to our own society, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the line between the respectable businessman and the ruthless crime lord can sometimes be vanishingly thin, and that the allure of power, in all its forms, is a force that can corrupt absolutely. His life stands as an eternal warning, a chilling echo from the past that reminds us that the greatest threats to our democracy are not always external, but can grow like a cancer from within, nurtured by apathy, greed, and the cynical belief that every man and every institution has its price. The humid air of New Orleans may have long since dissipated his physical presence, but the chilling lesson of his reign endures, a silent, sobering testament to the enduring battle between light and shadow, between law and chaos, and between the America we aspire to be and the dark reflections that sometimes, terrifyingly, we become. The story of Carlos Marcello is a chilling chapter in the annals of American history, a tale of immense power built in the shadows and a legacy forever intertwined with national tragedy. We have journeyed from the sweltering bayous of Louisiana to the halls of power in Washington, tracing the rise and fall of a man who believed he was above the law. If this deep dive into the hidden mechanisms of power has captivated you, if you find yourself intrigued by these complex figures who shaped our world from the darkness, then your journey does not have to end here. The channel is a repository of such stories, each one meticulously researched and narrated to bring you the unvarnished truth. To ensure you don't miss our next exploration into the forgotten, the mysterious, and the outright shocking, please show your support. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you can join us as we continue to uncover the secrets of the past. Your